This is probably one of my favorite lectures, and quite frankly, I feel it might be one of the most important ones. And it's not, something that's dogmatic per se. It's about how to see the world through the lens of beauty. The last class, we talked about the tyranny of subjective narratives, that we all get, locked into our own particular echo chambers. Then the only way for us to sort of have a relatable discussion with somebody else, well, we can't really have a relatable discussion. So we almost have to impose our particular views on another individual or group. We're going to look at on Friday how beauty is connected to faith, and then on Monday how beauty will save the world, before we have our final discussion and call this a wrap. So this is going to be more in a sense of about how we see beauty. What are the objective aspects to it, and are there any subjective aspects, and how those things might perhaps influence the way we look at other ideas. Let me just ask you up front, when you think about beauty, do you think it's like the old phrase, beauty's in the eye of the beholder? Or do you think that there's really something objective about beauty? And you could be right and wrong, and I'm not going to play gotcha with anybody. So what do you think? Anybody? If somebody came up to you and said, "My, you are beautiful," you would thank you. Could you imagine if you followed up by saying, "Why do you find me beautiful?" Now, I know that would be awkward, but I wonder what they would say. "I like your hair, I like your eyes, you seem nice." You'd like to think that's not just their perception, right? I mean, because if beauty is only in the eye of the beholder, wouldn't the only answer would be, "Well, I'm glad you think so." you know, um, we'd have a hard time hanging our hat on exactly what beauty might be. Any thoughts? Come on, it's only Wednesday. We're not Friday yet, but anyway, okay. Has anybody read C.S. Lewis? Let's start there. You've heard of C.S. Lewis? You got a nod.
Yeah.
Has anybody read The Abolition of Man? Okay, it's probably one of my favorites. It's a thin book, right? And you can get it as a PDF. Even the text in it's pretty, pretty large. So it's probably like a 30-some page PDF. Now, I won't get into why he calls it The Abolition of Man, but let me start out with this story that he put together. And on first hearing, you might find it a little odd and maybe even a little, I want to say, petty, but I'll try to make the case for it. He talks about this book that's used. It's like a literature book, a textbook for middle school. I think it was middle school, perhaps high school. He calls it the Green Book. That's just what he calls it, but it's an actual book, and we know the name, even though he doesn't mention it in his text. And then the two editors, he calls them Bias and Tisius. Now that's just Latin for guy and fellow. And in the book, there's a story of Coleridge and Wordsworth, and also I guess his sister, when they are out on, let's say, a nature walk, and they come up to a waterfall. And in the journal, it says the waterfall was sublime. Now, the authors, Gaius and Titius, say that there's nothing sublime in the waterfall. When those people say the waterfall is sublime, they're really just talking about their own emotions and their own sentiments and how they feel about the waterfall. Okay. Well, that sets C.S. Lewis off. Now, you might think, well, that's pretty petty. But there's things here that are underneath this that are rather important. So he makes the argument that, now, think about yourself. Have you ever been out and saw a sunset, right? Or you're at the ocean and you're looking at the ocean and said it's beautiful. You could think the same scenario here. Is it beautiful because you think so? Or is it really beautiful and you just sort of, been exposed to that beauty? So Lewis says, if we're going to pretend this is nothing more than a person's subjective feelings, then what's that going to do to our relationality and how we understand these things? For instance, what it's going to wind up doing is it's going to wind up having people think there really isn't much sense to any of this. In other words, if everything is boiled down to your feelings and emotions, then all these statements are really unimportant. If somebody said to you, I really think you're beautiful. And it wasn't something objective there, then, like I said, all you could really answer back is, well, I'm glad you think so. But it's just their opinion. Now, let me give an analogy so you don't think this is just being some silly, philosophical talk. We've said before that there are the Catholic Church believes and states that there are truths in other religions and other denominations, right? If you stretch that too far and say, well, they're all true, or it's only true for you and it's not true for me, you're not that far from realizing that it's really not important. Because if we reduce everything down to something that's constructed, in other words, there's nothing. Remember, we talked about the postmodern fallout, the lack of essentials, and the foundationalism. If there's nothing essential to beauty, if there's nothing, essential, in essence, to a truth, and it's just your truth and my truth, then anybody with half a sense is going to realize it doesn't matter, because you're just telling me what you think, and I'm telling you what I think. Let's go off and live our lives. That's pretty much what's happened in our society when it comes to this aspect of religion. But he's trying to make the point here that it started with beauty. And we're going to realize, as these individuals have said in that book, Gaius and Pythias, that there's really nothing important being said here. As silly as it might sound, Lewis is critiquing them by claiming that when they say there's really nothing in the waterfall that's sublime, only their feelings, that they're doing something quite dangerous, all right? Now, before you think that's an overstep, Lewis is trying to make the point that in education, one should be propagating truth and not trying to use propaganda to convince somebody of it. None of us like to be sold something, right, unawares. Think of how advertising works, how advertising might perhaps convince us of a particular product that we don't need, or it's not that good, but we thought it's good because it has a certain name associated with it. In other words, we bought into a sales pitch. We bought into the propaganda. That's how we would talk about it, right? Propagation is, think of watering or nurturing a garden. How can you help this thing grow? How can you help them do it so on their own, within their own nature? I've had a lot of professors over the years. You get, 4 degrees together, and before you know, you've had a lot of professors. I've had a few very good ones, and I've had many very bad ones. But I could almost live with incompetency. What I couldn't live with was the ones who were dogmatic. In other words, they were almost forcing me to accept what they were saying just based on the fact that they were saying it. So you have to judge me by yourselves. But even like reading your essays, oftentimes I vehemently disagreed with you, but I tried to never show up in the comments. All I tried to do is show you where your argument might be weak or strong, because the whole goal in education is to help people think critically, not to simply tell them what to think. Propaganda tells people what they think. Propagation helps people think. What C.S. Lewis is critiquing this textbook of is propaganda. In other words, the minute you start telling young people that there is nothing in that particular waterfall that's objectively sublime, it's just their feelings, people aren't stupid. It's not going to be too long until they realize, well, if everything boils down to a constructed element or just a person's feelings, it's really not important. And he says, at that point, we have some issues, all right? So that's the whole idea behind this idea of waterfall being sublime, and how he says to do something more to remark on their feelings. So what he tries to make the point then, the chapter that you were supposed to at least look at, the Men Without Chest, which is one of the chapters in the Abolition of Man, he breaks the man down into 3 parts in the human person. So he's think of human here, right? He breaks the person down into 3 parts. The visceral would be the gut, right? That's where our emotion and our drives are, our instinctual drives. The chest would be the part where we have virtue and honor and, the heart, right? And the head would be the cerebral. So you have these 3 parts. And what he's trying to say is that as important as the cerebral is, it's not the only part. As important as the emotive aspects of our life are, because we are incarnate beings and our emotions are an important aspect of who we are as individuals, he goes, that alone too can't do it. So remember how I said in the last class that too often the veracity of an argument is determined by the level of outrage? In other words, we stomp our feet and get our way. Maybe not so blatant, but we do that in the way that we argue. Not that an emotional argument isn't important, it's just that it can't stand on its own. The same thing with just an intellectual argument. We need something more because we're not just intellectual beings. So what he says is that the virtue, the heart, that has to regulate those two things. If you don't have a liaison between the head and the guts, then you're either going to have people that are just thinking on an intellectual level. If you want a character, think of Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory, or people who are only working on an emotional level. In other words, they're just, emotional wrecks. They get basically tossed about by the tides that are in their lives. Now, in the text, it says that it calls it men without chest. And what it means is that we have spent so much time nurturing the visceral and so much time nurturing the intellectual that we have left the virtue aside. And if the virtue is what's necessary to regulate the two, that's really put us in a predicament. So for instance, what would be like if we talk about honor? Now, honor is that thing that nobody could buy. And honor is that thing that, like I remember my mom when I was young, my mom would always say, don't do something stupid because you're going to give us a bad name. I kept thinking, well, if I did it, why would it give you a bad name? Because she would know the association. Well, as I got older, I realized what she was talking about. It takes a long time to recapture honor, right? Like if a person is, say they've gotten themselves in a bad habit of exaggerating and lying, they make a determinative effort to stop that. It takes a long time. It even takes a longer time to convince the people around you that you're no longer an exaggerator or liar. So these things have to be nurtured over a long period of time. But would we say that honor is only something that's subjective? Like, for instance, if I told you the story of a particular religious individual who was a pacifist and refused to carry a gun during the war, he wasn't a coward either. So when he was drafted, he said, I'll go, but I will not carry a gun. I'll be a medic. And during the war, and there's a story out there, there's a movie made about this, the individual was running, in the midst of gunfire without any weapon to defend himself, dragging wounded soldiers at the risk of his own life. Now, the story aside, we would say that that's an honorable individual. Would somebody say that's not honorable? Well, then honorable has to be something objective. It can't just be what you think and I think. There has to be something essential to honor. And that's not an intellectual pursuit. It has an intellectual component, but the person doesn't make an intellectual determination that I'm going to go out and put myself in harm's way because I think it's advantageous for me to bring back these people before they die. Nobody's going to make that kind of discursive, argument. And you're not just going to basically just be an emotional person. It's either going to run from the fire or run into the fire like you're reckless or a coward, right? So this visceral has to be mediated by the heart, as does the intellectual. And he says, we've lost that. So, as an aside, when they do baseline testing on young people today, it's have literally no significant deviation up or down from young people in the 1960s and 1970s. But yet the number of A's that people have been awarded have gone up 70%. Think of that, So we don't have anybody smarter today than we did 50 years ago, in essence. We don't have people that have probably more emotional or gut instinct today than they did 50 years ago. But we think we're smarter. And we think that we're more emotional driven and such. C.S. Lewis is making a point that it only looks that way because our chests have been shrunk, because we don't really hold these virtues anymore in high esteem. So because our chests are smaller, our heads look bigger. Heads are the same size. All we have today, according to C.S. Lewis, are men without chest. You get how he's going with this? I think it's a decent critique, all right? But I'm not going to make its whole story. You'd have to read it to get more into it. So what I'm going to try to say then is that there are things to beauty that are objective. If there's not, then we're not going to have a lot of discussions on what is or is not beautiful. There's no reason to have a discussion. You like it, I like it. Now, we now have to make sure that when we talk about beauty, we're not just talking about taste. In other words, my wife made these Italian S cookies. I don't know if you ever had it with anise. Oh my God, they're so good. My wife doesn't really care for them. I love them. I have a different taste than she does. When I use beautiful in that sense, like those cookies are beautiful, I'm not being very clear. I'm equivocating. I probably should be saying, I like those. That's okay for somebody to say they like us. When they start talking about us as beautiful, you'd hope to think that it's something objective. So I want to give you like a real quick overlay, some historical, I'm talking real quick, on how beauty was understood. So in a few centuries, or so, a couple centuries prior to the 20th with C.S. Lewis, beauty was something that's rather subjective. So David Hume never saw this real connection between a cause and an effect. In other words, something happens and then there's an effect. The effect always seems to follow the cause. We don't ever know the connections, which basically left him in skepticism. So beauty would have no play in that, right? He says beauty is just something that exists only in the mind. And since everybody has their own mind and their own intellect, then beauty can really only be something subjective. So when you say something's beautiful, maybe I can agree with you, but we couldn't have a discussion, an argument on if something is beautiful outside of both of our particular perceptions. When Immanuel Kant, he tried to bring everything away from a morality based on religion to a morality that was basically just based on reason. He did the same thing with beauty. But with beauty, he thought this is not a judgment. Nobody decides it's beautiful. In other words, you can't put together a syllogism that's going to explain why this is not beautiful. So he said, it's just, again, going to be some particular person's, I want to say, subjective perception. That's what we have inherited. Remember I said how we always are a product of the cultures that we live in? It's difficult for us to not think that beauty is entirely subjective. But we've inherited that. If you go back prior to these people, you're not going to find a single individual that talks about beauty in an objective sense. So from the ancient Greeks on up, that's the only way they understood it. It's only in very recent times, and by that I mean the last few centuries, that we're looking at it in a different way. When Augustine talks about beauty, he asks the question, does beauty give us delight because it's beautiful? Or is it only beautiful because we give it delight? In other words, am I calling the cookie good because I like it, or is the cookie good, therefore I like what's good? So he's going to say, there's beauty there, and we find delight in it. So if you were to ask Augustine, is the waterfall sublime? Without hesitation, he'd say, absolutely. It's sublime when we recognize that. In the same way that you might stand on a beach and look at the ocean, or you might be at a lake and look at the sunset and say it's beautiful. I'd like to think that there's something there that really is beautiful, and you found it. That would be Augustine. Plato, remember Plato outside the cave were the ideas, and the ideas were perfect. You may not have access to them in a direct way, only through the shadows, but nonetheless, they're perfect. And beauty is one of those ideas that is in reality perfect, and it's out there. So he actually came up with the definition of beauty, and he called it the splendor of truth. In other words, there's things that are so true that we find beautiful. So I'm going to give you a couple examples, but it could be that there's things that just sort of hit us between the eyes, experiences and such. And there's a truth that's embedded within that experience, and it sort of stops us to the point where we actually will call the whole experience beautiful. But we're doing that in a very objective way. Okay? Aristotle talked about beauty in terms of harmony. So here you can almost think of when you have a plan and your plan works out, you know how colloquially we say, that was beautiful. The reason why we're saying something like that is because we have a sense that things were how they should be. There's a harmony to it, right? So think maybe in terms of like a mathematical equation that just works out perfectly, or an engineering plan that just did exactly what it's supposed to do. The fact that there's something there that exudes perfection, we find beauty in it. But see, those things are objective. So Augustine, Plato, Aristotle, all the ancients always thought beauty, and medievals always thought that beauty was something very objective. Hume, Kant, and the moderns, and especially when you get into the postmodern sense, when you get away with essentialism and foundationalism, there can be nothing essential to beauty. It is entirely subjective. It's what you think it is, and it's what I think it is. But in the words of C.S. Lewis, how long will it take before we realize it's just our own particular feelings, and that doesn't matter. That's what you think, right? That kind of thing. So it's not that it doesn't have these subjective elements. But what I'm trying to say is that you can have a subjective experience in a very objective truth. And it can only be your experience. But that experience has something universal to it. So I don't spend a lot of time watching TV, so I don't watch America's Got Talent or Britain's Got Talent, whatever those shows are, American Idol. But I like watching on YouTube sometimes some of the performances. And I don't know if you've ever seen, sometimes, like I saw one, it was a South Korean episode where a young man who was homeless for 15 years and just sold energy drinks and gums to make a living, and slept in, and this is him testifying to this, and he slept in the public toilets. But he would always set up his little, stand outside of this bar or this restaurant where they had a person in there singing, and he was mesmerized by it. So he sang this song that just blew everybody away. It's like, in other words, how did that voice come out of this individual? Now, it's hard to process that. It can almost overwhelm you emotionally. That doesn't mean it's only emotional. It doesn't mean it's not intellectual. But there's something there that's hitting us from a virtue standpoint. Another example, I saw this one where this woman was in her late 30s and her young daughter actually signed her up. And now she started singing, and it really wasn't working, and Simon stopped her. Well, the minute he started saying, okay, just stop the music, everybody thought he's going to like walk her off stage. But he said, I don't think that exactly works for you. Do you have something else you can sing? Yes, I do. Do that. She started singing it, and boy, it just hit it. And then they panned to her daughter at the end when everybody was standing and clapping. They panned to her daughter, and her daughter was like filled with tears. Now you might say, well, that's just being emotional. It's not. It's saturated. It's like a sponge that can't hold all the water, and it just has to pour out somewhere. So if you've ever been in a moment where you almost can't absorb it, and it's too much for you to really take in, that's a beautiful idea. But it's beautiful because it's something objective. So I have a few, ways to illustrate this. You don't think I'm just talking entirely abstract. If we look at a snowflake underneath some magnification, is that beautiful because you think it's beautiful, or do you think it's beautiful and you've discovered its beauty? I mean, there's something there. You could see a harmony there. You could see some sort of perfection there. You could see something that's almost sublime. It's like, how does this thing actually do this? It's not perfectly symmetrical, but it is. It's like if you were an artist and you were to draw this, you would say, good job. But yeah, here's something that's just been discovered in nature. So is beauty objective in that snowflake, that ice crystal? Or is it just something that we think it is? Because if it's just what you think it is, what I think it is, it's not that important, right? How about this young lady? I don't care what age we're in. If we go back to medieval times, ancient Judea, or modern day, I don't care what race or ethnicity you are. Somebody said this young girl is not beautiful. Now, people might say, well, doesn't, body shapes and beauty change over time? Somewhat. But I don't think in this case. I'd have a hard time believing that somebody would say this is not beautiful. They might have a hard time explaining why it's beautiful. That'd be an interesting to use. But they would say there's something there. And I don't think they would just say, well, it's only beautiful because I think it is. I think they would say, can't put my finger on it. There's something beautiful about that young girl, and I've discovered it. That's a different way to look at it. This is not a picture of an older couple. This is actually a man in his 80s who needs nursing care, and his mother is still alive. That's his mother. She's 98 years old or so. She's moved in to take care of him. One of those things that tugs on our emotions. But is that all it does? All of us are children of someone, right? We have a relationship with parents. We know what that relationship is. Even if it's not a good one, we know what a good one is. We also know that it never ends. So when you become a parent, God willing, there's going to be certain things that, the success and happiness for your children come before you. And you have no problem giving up whatever. My wife gave up an entire career. So everything she had planned, get away with it. My daughter, she gets her degrees, wanted to raise children, so she's not using any of that for now. And this kind of brings us up to another truth that never goes away. Could you imagine? So how can somebody look at this and not say that's beautiful? Now, is it only beautiful because you and I think it is? Or is it beautiful and we've discovered it? If it's the latter, then the waterfall is sublime in itself. It's not just because we say it is, okay? This individual in the doorway on the right killed the child of that woman on the left. He spent 17 years in prison and then moved in next door. You can read the backstory on this. But all the hatred that she would have, all the venom that's probably in her heart for what she lost, and the retribution that she probably asked for, she let it all slide, and she embraced this guy as her own son. Now, could you imagine if this was you? Could you imagine if somebody gave you that level of forgiveness? It would blow you over. I don't think you'd be able to process it. That's a saturated moment, right? So you're to this point where you don't even know how to really hold all this in. Now, is this beautiful because you think it is? Or is it beautiful because there's something there of forgiveness and love that's true? And this is just an example of it. If it's the latter, then it's because the waterfall is sublime in itself. Hume and Kant have kind of taken that away. Postmodern the misunderstandings of essentialism and such. If we believe in constructs, like we're going to construct an essence of something, that's going to have to include beauty, and it's something more than what we think it is. And the only way then to convince somebody else of what we call beautiful or true or good is going to be used in some tyrannical motive. Again, the tyranny. So that's the part of the goal behind all of this. Now, how important is beauty? Let me ask you this: has anybody here ever? Do you know who Aldous Huxley is? Anybody? Nods, hand raising. Anybody? Did anybody read Aldous Huxley in high school? So sad. Things have really gone down. Has anybody read Fyodor Dostoevsky? Alexander Solzhenitsyn? Just as an aside, because has anybody ever read Richard Wright? The Outsider, Native Son, Black Boy. All right. Now, here's the power of literature. People's going to say, well, it's fiction. It's not true. No, it's fiction, and it's very true. Historical. What it tries to do is it tries to give you the power of certain things that are experiences that we share in. In other words, if the experiences weren't universal, like I have never experienced losing a child and then having to have some sort of a relationship with the person who killed that child. So that's not an experience that I share, but I get it, right? There's something there that I get. So let me give you the backstory to Brave New World, and then I'm going to bring this up. Brave New World was written in the 1940s by Aldous Huxley. It's a dystopian, goofy future novel. It's written with the idea that there is now a very regulated scientific community. The great wars are over, and now everybody lives in peace and harmony based on scientific principles. So what they've done, remember I told you before how, eventually prejudice will go away, racial, ethnic, maybe even social class. But prejudice never goes away. It's almost as if like a beach ball trying to be held underneath the water. It always pops up somewhere. Well, the way prejudice shows itself up in this dystopian, future-oriented novel is it stratifies everybody according to what they do and what they need. So, in other words, everything comes through a genetic line. Nobody has sex anymore. Everything is done in vitro fertilization, and all children are done in incubators, so artificial wombs. The world needs factory workers. There's no sense having a factory worker with a really high intellect. What would they do with it? All they're really doing is just automated type machine type labor. So they are the epsilons. They are genetically engineered to be physically healthy and industrious, but they don't really question things because we don't want them questioning things. The people who might be their managers might be the deltas. You need a little more, knowledge and such on how to manage all of this. So they need to know more than the epsilons, and they're glad they're not epsilons. But the epsilons are glad they're not deltas because it's easy to do what they do. In other words, we're the ditch diggers. We don't need to know anything more than that. There's also betas and there's also the alphas, right? Everybody fits into this. So everybody's sort of like engineered just to do nothing more or only what they're able to do. Now, before this sounds like this is some ridiculous future plot, what this has done is this has done away with beauty, and it's done away with all the liberal arts. So are we not, I'm not saying St. Joe's is a liberal arts school, and this is why you guys are in this class. But when people start thinking, why am I taking this? I don't need it. The minute a person thinks that, you've already committed yourself to the fact that all you need is practical knowledge. Practical knowledge is vocation. It's important. Now, we have vocation schools within a liberal arts school. That's a newer thing. You wouldn't have found that 100 years ago. Nursing school, business school, education, all those things that have been separate, right? You would have been trained very generally and very broadly in the liberal arts, and then you would have specialized in one of those things. Today, people, we tend to go a little bit different road. Okay, so that's the deal. So everybody there, there's no literature, there's no music. When you want happiness, everybody wants happiness, you take Soma. It's like a pill. And you can go out, they call it a Soma holiday. Uh, Individuals aren't even supposed to love because love, see, the problem with people loving each other and people having exclusive relationships is that it develops jealousy and other things that are not good for society. So you're encouraged to have as many sexual partners as possible, and sex never leads to procreation. So if you start to have relations with one person too much, the actual, you want to call it the commanders and stuff, might find that out and bring in for reprogramming. So they have slogans. Promiscuity is a citizen's duty. You need to keep everything moving. So we need to reproduce more, and you can't produce more. People aren't consuming more. So don't fix things. Fixing things hurts the economy. Throw it away. So they have another slogan. Mending is better than ending, or ending is better than mending. So everything here is quite close, but two of the characters start to have romantic relations, and one wants to go further, but they know that they can't do this. He gets very curious and starts asking questions that go outside of the realm of their particular little city. He, because he's an official in the government, he can get a helicopter and goes on a ride. And what's outside the city are the reservations. Now, I know this is culturally insensitive, but they call them the savages, and they live on reservations. And they're pretty much almost like going out and looking at the natives, how they live in their natural habitat. But those people live like we do now. It's a fight for their own life. They have to grow their own food. The plane crashes. I'm sorry, the helicopter crashes. And what they do is they bring one of the savages, John, back to their city. But they don't know how to process this guy. This guy's into literature. He's into beauty. He kept saying to people, what have you done? You've taken away everything that is good in the world, and you've replaced it. And he said, yes, but we replaced it with, we don't get sick anymore. There's no more illnesses. We don't have to worry about people not being economically deprived. There's no racism. There's none of this. We've done away with all of that. And he starts to make the argument, you've lost everything. You've lost what it is to be human. So he puts this up, and this comes from one of the, chapters. This is the savage John talking. He's talking to Mustafa Mon, the actual commander. He says, I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want danger. I want freedom. I want goodness, and I want sin. Mustafa says, so you're claiming the right to be unhappy, which he can't wrap his head around. Why in God's name would somebody not want to be happy? And he goes, yes, it's exactly. I'm claiming the right to be unhappy. I want to grow old. I want to be ugly. I want to be impotent. I want to have syphilis and cancer. I want to eat too little. I want the right to be lousy, the right to live in constant apprehension of what may happen tomorrow. I want the right to catch typhoid, tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind. There's a long silence, and he's like, claim them all. In other words, this is the human condition. And all he's really saying in the end is, I want to be human. Now, it's difficult for somebody to think, how is this connected to beauty, right? During World War II, in the United States, at least back in the 70s and 80s, the Polish were always the butt of a joke. Every country has their own ethnicity or culture that they make fun of. So in the United States, it was the Poles. The irony behind that is that the Polish are probably the most resilient people that have lived in our world. Their country's been invaded by everybody. Not only have they retained their country, they've retained their culture. So during World War II, some went and fought with the resistance. Others went and became actors and wrote poetry. That must sound pretty odd. You would think that the people who were fighting physically would have disdain for the people that stayed back and entered, drama, underground drama organizations, but they weren't, because they said, that's important, because they're not just trying to take our land; they're trying to destroy who we are as a people, and you need to preserve who we are as a people. And that's what art does. So let me ask you this, because the last class there was a bunch in your high schools. How many of them have reduced the funding or the participation in band, in drama, in the art program? Any of that happen in any of your high schools?
They tried to in mine, but we rallied and didn't let them do it.
Good, Good. Anybody else? I know my local high school, they tried to do away with the marching band entirely. And they had a fight to get it back, but it took years. But they're not doing this because they don't like music and art. They're doing this because they don't find it to be practical. And if they don't find it to be practical, they're going back to the same problem. What use is it? Well, if we're in a situation now where we have men without chest because people aren't growing in virtue, well, what good is virtue? It's not really going to do a politician very good, is it? I mean, we might like to have a politician as virtuous, but if we had a politician that stood up there and spewed virtue, we'd make fun of him. You know we would. And C.S. Lewis even says that, right? He says, this is the problem. Because we want people to aspire to these particular things. We want people to be great, leaders with magnanimous spirit. But the minute they are, we try to find chinks in their armor and break them down. We want to find the faults in them, right? Corruptio timi pessima, the fall of the greatest is the worst. So when like a priest or a minister or a policeman do something that's atrocious, that really hurts our spirit because we think they should not be the ones doing that. But if we're expecting these things out of them, but then we often make fun of them when they're virtuous. Think of yourself in high school, maybe even in college. Did you have a friend who's just the nicest person in the world, but they got made fun of all the time because they weren't cool, they didn't have enough political clout to cover themselves? It happens all the time, right? In other words, we make fun of the person who's always trying to be the good person, trying to be kind, who doesn't need to simply, be the sports figure. If there's anything wrong with sports, to be the sports figure that gets political clout in the school. So that's what C.S. Lewis is trying to say, that we've kind of turned all this around. And that's what Aldous Huxley's trying to say here, is that we're losing the very thing that's making our lives worth living. Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote in The Possessed. Now understand this is Russian literature. So he writes Shakespeare and Raphael, the artists. They are more precious than the emancipation of the serfs, more precious than nationalism, more precious than socialism, more precious than the young generation, more precious than chemistry, almost all humanity, because they are the fruit of all humanity, perhaps the highest fruit. He goes, you know what? We could do without the English. We could do without humanity. We could do without the German. We could do without Russians. We could do without science. We could do without bread. Through all those things, life is still possible. But if you remove beauty, there's nothing left in the world. Now, that's an interesting statement. It seems like that's just hyperbole, right? Here's the thing, I'm going to end, and then I'd really like you to give me some feedback. We're going to talk more about this on Friday. This is known as the epistemological ladder. These are transcendentals, the ancients, and this isn't just Christian. The ancients thought that these are the things that both God and humans share. And epistemology is how you know. So epistemological ladder would be that you need to step on the bottom rung to get to the second rung, to get to the third rung. The bottom rung is beauty. Beauty leads to truth. Truth leads to goodness. So here's how this works. If you really believe that goodness is something objective, in other words, when you call something good, is it really good, or is it just because you think it's good? I don't believe you just think it's good. It's good and you recognize it's good. The only way to know what is good is by knowing truth. The only way by knowing truth is by knowing beauty. So the idea is, and we're going to look this on Friday, there's another line from Solzhenitsyn that, the soul is the battlefield of the human person, and beauty is what the devil and God is fighting over. In other words, if you take a ladder and it has 3 rungs on it, and you take away the bottom rung, you can't get to the second one. So in an epistemological ladder, if you can get rid of a person's understanding of beauty, make it entirely subjective, then before you know it, truth is relative. Your truth and my truth. Can there be any real truth? And goodness is entirely relative. What's good? We're not worrying about what's good. We're only worried about what's useful. And at that point, we've all reached the segment in life where we realize none of it matters anymore. So we just go about our own business. We live in practical relationships, and we struggle to find meaning. So that's the whole point here. This is not to be some philosophical background on beauty, but we're not going to be able to make the case that in morality, beauty is tied to that, because morality and goodness are tied together. And if we're going to seek justice, and we want justice to come from what's good for the human person, we're going to have to say that a human person has an actual essence. We're going to have to say that goodness has a particular essence. And we're going to have to say what is good for the human person. Happiness is good, but what is happiness? Love is good, what is love? Justice is good, what is justice? We're going to have to really try to iron those things out, which means that we're going to base them in things that are true. Not just true for you or true for me, but true for everybody. Which means then beauty will lead us to those things. So if you're the type of individual that you've been on a nature hike or something, and you've seen a waterfall or such, or maybe a ruined old stone, building, you stop and you look at it. If you're an artist, this is easier for you. And you don't think that it's beautiful just because you think so. You think it's beautiful and you're trying to figure out why it's beautiful. You wouldn't do that if you didn't think it's true. That's my spiel. What do you think about this? Let me hear something. Um, Let me say this while you're thinking. Came up in the last class. Do you notice how, have you ever listened to a song and it really caught your ear, and then only later you realize the lyrics aren't that great? In other words, they might be offensive. Have you ever heard a joke and you laughed until you realized what it was really trying to say? And then you thought, oh my God, it's racist. I didn't realize it until I thought about it for a second. This is the danger if we don't keep all like the visceral and the virtue and the intellect in harmony. Beauty, okay, let's say this. Humor and music have the ability to bypass our reason. So if reason is the gate, like reason is the thing that we're going to use to determine whether this is good for us. Um, Humor and music or other types of art can get around that. In other words, I remember teaching years ago. I don't know if anybody ever heard the song Rude Boy. I heard a couple of young girls before a class, they were singing it. And I haven't heard the lyrics they were singing. I didn't say anything. And they did this a couple of mornings. And then on the one time out, like, hey, professor, did you ever hear that song? And I said, I did. Said, do you like it? I said, have you ever read the lyrics? And they're like, what do you mean? I said, can you just go and, look up the lyrics? They came in the next, almost ashamed. They said, oh my God, I have no idea. I said, isn't it something? I said, catchy tune. I said, and it went right around our reason. I said, but it affects us, doesn't it? I mean, that kind of stuff can affect our hearts without us knowing. The same thing with humor. Before, if somebody tell a joke and you laugh, and all of a sudden you start to crack a half smile, thinking, I didn't know. It sounded funny, but now that I think about it, that's bad. Um, that's part of the issue. So you think of how advertising works and how we can be sold things. I don't only just mean products, right? We can be sold ideas. This is why propaganda and slogans are so effective. It can kind of like sneak around. In other words, we can be sold something's ugly while thinking it's beautiful. And that's what I'm trying to go at. If we start accepting things that are ugly as beauty, then those things become the ladder to what? Not to goodness, not the truth, but to relativism. And if we're going to fall into relativism, then it's going to be just a matter of time before we try to use our power, if we have that, to convince somebody else of what we think is true. Give me something. Well, it's not Friday yet. Stop the.
Um, maybe what you said about like the waterfall, or if you've gone on like a hike and seen something pretty. I guess like maybe the feeling it gives you, like if it gives you a sense of like calmness, that's why it's beautiful.
Could be.